afternoon or this morning if you're calling in from Hawaii. The webinar for today is titled Beyond the Numbers, Strategies for Effectively Reporting and Communicating CTE Data. This is one of many different webinars in a series of Advance CTE programs to support you in learning more about the cutting edge and innovative work that we're seeing related to CTE across the country. This session will be recorded and it's going to be shared on the Advance CTE website at careertech.org for your future reference. If you do have any questions at any time, we'd encourage you to submit them via the Q&A box on your screen. We've got some time set up at the end of our session today to address some of those questions. You're also welcome to contribute to the conversation throughout. If you want to share some stories from your own home state or kind of respond to some of the presentations, you can do so in the chat box. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Austin Estes. I'm the Manager of Data and Research with Advance CTE. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, Katie Graham, the State CTE Director from Nebraska. We're going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is CTE data. So just to start, what's the point of CTE data to begin with? The purpose of collecting and reporting CTE data is not only to comply with federal accountability requirements for Perkins 5, but it's to empower stakeholders to make informed decisions, to improve equitable access to CTE programs, to continuously improve the quality of those programs, and to help advance the field through research. I love this quote from Sherlock Holmes, who said, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts." So CTE data can allow us to make informed decisions, and it can also help empower different stakeholders to get a better sense of of what CTE looks like in their states. Perkins 5 provides a perfect opportunity for state and local leaders to improve the way that they're reporting and communicating their CTE data with different stakeholders. The law reinforces the existing focus on data and accountability and includes new requirements for state and local leaders. So just a quick recap of those requirements. I know many of you are very familiar with this at this point, but under Perkins 5, states must report disaggregated performance indicators to the U.S. Department of Education every year, and they're required to be disaggregated by race, ethnicity, gender, migrant status at the secondary level, and special population groups. And they're also required to be disaggregated by career cluster or program of study. States must identify and quantify gaps in performance between groups of learners in these reports. And Perkins 5 requires states and local recipients to report the data to the public. And it has specific language about how the data should be reported, that it should be shared widely, including to students, parents, and educators through a variety of formats, including electronically through the internet, and in user-friendly formats in languages that are easily accessible. So to sum that up, it's important to make sure that the data is available to a wide audience and that it's easily accessible and easy to understand. And again, these are the requirements that states must meet under Perkins 5, but we think that this should serve as the floor and not the ceiling for what states are reporting and how they're using data. So this could really be a springboard to launch broader efforts around sharing out data, using data, and communicating data with the public. Last year, Advance CTE worked with the Association for Career and Technical Education to pull together a shared solutions work group of state and national leaders to dig deeper into some of these challenges and explore strategies for reporting CTE data. The work group identified some common challenges across the states, which I've summarized here for you. One of the major challenges that we heard is around kind of access and differentiation of data. So a lot of times states are just posting their consolidated annual report online somewhere. So the data is available, it's accessible, but there isn't an effort to kind of differentiate data based on audience. So understanding what do policymakers need to know versus what do teachers and administrators or students need to know. Another challenge is developing resources that are user-friendly, that allow users to easily understand what the data says and find answers to their questions in an appealing and visually appealing way. Communication is another major challenge. A lot of times states have some challenges with pulling key insights from their data and crafting a compelling narrative about CTE. Or at the same time, they might have a communications initiative that's already underway. And so bridging that gap and bringing the CTE data into communications efforts is another challenge. And then lastly, we heard a lot of that improving the quality of CTE data is another challenge too, making sure that what you're reporting is accurate and reflects what's happening in the CTE system more broadly. Last November, the work group developed and released 2 resources, which I want to highlight today to help states think through how they report and communicate their CTE data. The first resource, which I'm going to explore in a little bit more detail today, is a design principles report that breaks down some recommendations and approaches for reporting CTE data. The second resource is a communications toolkit, which includes easy-to-use templates and tools that can help states leverage their CTE data to support ongoing communications initiatives. And I believe Sarah can share some of the links for those resources in the chat. I've included the links on the screen here, and we'll share the slides out with folks after today's presentation as well, so you can access those resources. So as I mentioned, the report includes 9 design principles and talks through how states can apply each of these through the development of CTE reporting tools. So the first one I want to talk about today is starting by focusing on clarifying your objectives and your purpose for using data. So you want to think about what you want to do with the data. Are you intending to help stakeholders make decisions, help learners understand which programs they want to enroll in? Are you using data to improve program quality? Are you using data for accountability purposes? Starting out by clarifying these objectives will help focus the design of your reports and help you select a format that is best for sharing the data. So for example, fact sheets might be helpful for building a case for CTE with policymakers or employers, because it can provide a quick snapshot of what the CTE system looks like and its benefits. Whereas a report card or some similar format might be more effective for public transparency and equity purposes. The second principle is to make data easy to find. A lot of times reporting is buried on website subpages. It's not clearly labeled in menus, and it can be found in multiple different places. Data reports and tools should be available in a central location and clearly labeled within the navigation menu so that users can find what they're looking for easily. Additionally, using clear language and terms in your reporting tools can help improve search engine optimization so that your tools are easy to find for users who are completing a simple Google search. And the Data Quality Campaign has some great resources to help states evaluate whether or not their reports are optimized for search engine use. Regardless of the type of data or report or visualization that you're using, there's some simple tricks that you can use to make the information visually appealing so that users can easily interpret the data. You don't have to be an artist to understand the best practices for data visualization. And in fact, there's a lot of research that shows how people consume data. I'm a data nerd. I love working on this stuff. My sister is a graphic designer. So the real challenge is finding somebody who bridges both skill sets and is able to kind of present data in a compelling way. The data visualization experts often recommend ordering data by frequency or time period, using horizontal labels that are positioned near the data, using hierarchical text size, so using large titles and small labels, coloring text in a way that contrasts with background color, and making sparing use of borders, grid lines, and axis lines. And there's a really helpful resource here from Stephanie Evergreen and Ann Emery that's includes a checklist that you can use to go through and actually evaluate on a 3-point scale whether your existing reports are meeting some of these standards. And again, these slides will be shared out after today's call, so you can access that link and use it yourself. I've included a few different examples of different types of data visualizations. These are directly from the report, so you can see different examples of how states are using bar charts, heat maps, tree maps, and other visualization tools to share out their CTE data. The fourth principle is to clearly and consistently label and describe your data. And this will help your reader make sense of the data and draw attention to critical information. Each visualization should have a brief title. And web design research has found that readers, particularly English readers, start at the upper left-hand corner, which is the prime location for placing a short descriptive title. It's also important to create user-friendly names and descriptions, avoid jargon or edu-speak. So for example, your audience might not know what Perkins Indicator 5S2 means, but if you label your data post-secondary credit attainment, that might be a little bit easier for different users to understand. And using tooltips, like this example from the Kentucky Center for Statistics, can help users access additional data, define terms, and provide simple interpretations of what the data show. This principle number 5 is probably one of the most important ones to keep in mind when you're designing different reporting tools. It's important to consider all different users, particularly those who might speak different languages or who have visual or hearing impairments that could affect their ability to access data in certain formats. This is called designing at the margins, considering the needs of users who will have the most barriers to access, and then working backwards from there, which makes it more universally accessible. Using sans serif fonts, color contrasts, and alternate text can make it easier for users with low vision to access your data. And resources like the No Coffee extension for Google Chrome can help you check whether your data is readable, including through technology such as screen readers. And then finally, just a note on translations. Make sure that if you are translating your reports into different languages, that you're testing those with folks who are fluent in those languages and not relying exclusively on Google Translate. Under Perkins 5, as I've already mentioned, data is required to be disaggregated by subgroups in order to highlight equity gaps. And this is absolutely essential to make sure that folks can use your data to understand how students are being served and where those gaps exist. There might be certain restrictions in who can access disaggregated data, especially once you get down to the college level or the school level due to privacy concerns around N sizes. But as I mentioned earlier around differentiating by audience, it's important to keep in mind who those limitations apply to. So if you're sharing a public report, you may need to restrict data, but if the report is being used by teachers or policymakers in your or other decision makers on your staff, they may need to access more specified data in order to make informed decisions. It's also important to remember that learners have multiple identities, and even disaggregating by the major Perkins 5 subgroups can mask deeper inequities. So it's important to consider how you can look across and filter by race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, disability, and other categories to more appropriately target resources so that all learners can succeed. And then one final note, consider using asset-based language when talking about equity to highlight and focus on student strengths and focus on student agency rather than highlighting deficits. And using language such as students experiencing homelessness instead of homeless students can reaffirm that student's agency. Sometimes reporting out enrollment or performance indicators alone isn't sufficient to give your audience the information that they need. So to the extent possible, think about how to bring in additional information to provide context to the data. So for example, you could include a statewide average to provide a benchmark. You could show longitudinal data for previous years, and you could provide labor market information or other types of information to provide further context. And here's an example from Indiana, which shows academic proficiency data for CTE concentrators alongside statewide data. Another important function of your reporting tools is to help users answer key questions about CTE in their state and in their community. So building interactive tools with filters, tooltips, and other features can help them engage with and better understand the data. There are a lot of different tools that are on the market to help build interactivity and to help build more customized reports. Some of them are a little bit pricey, but you don't have to have a big budget for dashboards in order to allow for this level of customization. For one, a lot of this can be, especially when you're working with practitioners, can be developed through the use of pivot tables and Excel spreadsheets or other simple approaches. Or if you can't provide this information through filters and other kinds of dashboards, think about and try to anticipate the questions that your users will have and present the data in a way that addresses their primary questions. This example from Maryland, I think is a really good one. It uses the Microsoft Power BI platform and allows users to filter data by location and by year. And it doesn't currently include performance data because it's not required to be reported for Perkins 5 yet. But I'm looking forward to seeing how that looks in the report in the future. And then lastly, design principle number 9 is to help users interpret data and take action. So using features such as captions and pop-out boxes can be useful for defining indicators and providing technical documentation, but can also help you explain the value of looking at CTE data to begin with and help users understand how to interpret the data that they're looking at. Going back to the first design principle, if your objective is to motivate action from users, you can also think about including action steps to help them take the next step. So for example, if you want them to share out a social media post to celebrate CTE month, then include a call to action or something in your reports. Or you can give them a link to access additional information if they want to do some further research. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Katie to walk us through some of her thinking from Nebraska. So Katie, go ahead and share your screen.
All right. Thank you so much, Austin. I'm so excited to be here today. Similarly, self-proclaimed data nerd, love talking about this, can talk about it all day. So always excited when I get the call from Advance CTE to participate. So as Austin mentioned, I'm Katie Graham. It's a privilege to serve as the state CTE director in Nebraska. And I just wanted to share a little bit about an approach or strategy that we've, I think, found pretty effective in Nebraska related to communicating data. Austin focused, or he mentioned early on, that there's this idea that we want to craft a compelling message. And so just wanted to share a little bit about what we've done. We've still got work to do, I think, as everybody does, but it hopefully will illustrate how we've put many of the design principles into practice and how we can, how we plan to continue to do that. So I often show or start presentations related to CTE with this little video. So you might have seen it before, so I apologize. It's really quick, but I think it'll set the stage nicely for moving forward.
Hey, bud. Remember, if you need anything, we're just a phone call away.
Don't forget to register for classes just as soon as they open, okay?
Okay, Mom, Dad, relax. I'm gonna make the most of these 4 years in school. I have a plan. Freshman year, I'm only gonna take intro courses or easier classes. Just kind of like whatever I feel like. Definitely nothing with a writing assignment, though.
But I thought you were majoring in English.
No, that's just gonna be my first major. Sophomore year, I plan on changing it like at least 3 more times. And eventually, I'm just gonna choose the one that I have the most number of credits in and has the least number of classes before noon. Which actually won't even make much of a difference anyway, because I won't be going all that much.
You won't be going to classes?
Academics aren't necessarily gonna be my focus, if you know what I mean. Oh, yeah.
Your mother and I think that you should have a more well-rounded experience than just partying.
No, of course, Dad. I'm on top of it. Junior year, I'm gonna study abroad in a foreign country that is rich with culture. But I'm only gonna hang out with other Americans. Mom, come on. Senior year, I'm gonna turn it all around. I'm gonna take a summer course, I'll change my major one more time, and then maybe I'll have enough credits to almost graduate on time. Almost.
Well, as long as you graduate with a plan, that's all that matters.
Well, after graduation, I'm gonna realize that the real world and trying to find a job where I can pay off tens of thousands of dollars in student debt is just way too scary. So I'm gonna go into grad school, I'm gonna hide out there for a couple of years, and that's where I'm really gonna rack up the debt. Like, rack it up. You guys, I am so excited for my future. Rack up job options.
All right. So as you can see, that was, I think it's a commercial for some financial planning support. But hopefully something in that resonated with you. Either frustration because you could see the path this young individual is starting down, or maybe you related to it a lot, either personally speaking, or if you have some other folks still living with you at home. But really at the heart of it, why this was so powerful and compelling, or how it's proved to be, is because it's a story and it's relatable, and something later today or tomorrow or in a week will remind you of this, and you might be able to recall it because there was some emotional attachment or connection to what was being shared. So another quote, Austin, this is one I like. If the quality of life is to be improved in this modern world, its citizens must understand how to make sense out of numbers. So a few years ago, before I was in this role, I served as the data specialist for CTE, and we had the opportunity as a state and applied for the TA to states, the technical assistance to states, through Octave. And through that, I was introduced to Steve Klein and others on his team who really helped us think about how we communicate data. And we were really excited in the beginning to show him and the team what we had produced, because on the surface, I thought, we really did apply many of the design principles that Austin shared. And I'll share that with you here. So this was one example of those fact sheets, those infographics that were all the rage. People loved it. Staff loved these. They could take them apart, block by block, and throw those stats into a presentation. They were on shiny, glossy paper, and people liked to hand them out. It was visually appealing. It did provide some context and added meaning when we did like comparison groups, or we added insights after a couple years with those light bulbs to try to tell folks kind of what they should take away from all of these numbers. But digging deeper and really thinking about it and applying a lot of these principles, we noticed that it violated a little of them. So from a quick look, the purpose for the whole piece wasn't really determinable. Like there's not even a title, a heading, for what we should be taking away. There was no direction on how to read this. Are you supposed to read it up or down or left to right? Was there a flow? There really wasn't a story. It was hard to tell what the main takeaway or the purpose for sharing these data was. It didn't even really highlight that this was for CTE. Or again, who is it for? Who are the people that should be doing something with these data? It was quickly evident that every piece, everything we create couldn't be all things to all people. But at a minimum, we did start asking ourselves, a few questions. What's the story? Why are we telling it? And to whom are we telling it to? So why stories? Again, just going back to that, beginning video, storytelling is a means for sharing and interpreting experiences that is innate to human life. Like human life is narratively rooted. We construct and shape our lives, based on memories and narratives and, how we go about our business. So they're very powerful. Actually, there's a lot of research based on that. Every culture has its own stories or narratives. In particular, though, stories can help address several of the design principles. It certainly can't, let's see if I can get my animation to work. It certainly can't address everything, but if you think about stories and what the strengths are with the stories, you'll see that these 5 principles in particularly are well suited to sharing or communicating your data with some sort of narrative. So one of the biggest changes in our mindset, biggest ahas to our approach was instead of leading with the numbers, really using the numbers to support the story. Advance CTE over the past several years has done a lot to help us in this space. They've done a lot of the research to say, well, what are the messages that resonate with folks? And I'll share some of that in just a minute. So we start with the story and its objectives, and then we naturally do what we do when we sit down a piece, and we try to make the implicit explicit. So again, how do we start it? With an intentional framing of what's the story? Why are we telling it, and who's that audience? Going again, you can refer back to the principles, and maybe certain pieces like the infographic we shared really didn't serve the purposes for which we were trying to communicate the data. So again, I always like to point this out too. Advance CTE and their wonderful staff have just done a great job helping us along this path, going and working with focus groups to say, what are those messages that resonate? How can we frame the story in something we know with different audiences will really help us, say what we're trying to say. So with that, and again, with Steve's help and others, I wanted to share just a little bit of how we tried to reframe that same piece. So this was several years ago. We have a lot of work still to do. But right off the bat, we changed the name. There's no title. It just says the year. We very intentionally tried to add some directionality to the story, and again, emphasize that story. So this is kind of what it looked like at the time. Right off the bat, there's directionality. You can see you start at the top, there's arrows pushing you along and over to the next part of the story. The narrative is first, not the numbers. The numbers support the narrative. And again, luckily for us, through the toolkit that Austin mentioned, there are a lot of templates in the toolkit that really adhere to the same principles. As you can see with this piece that we can all customize for our own states or locally, it starts with the story. It's clear, what the purpose of this communication piece is. And then the numbers there serve to support that story. I did also just want to take a minute and share a little bit about some internal reporting. So obviously that was very external facing, very public, trying to oftentimes make the case or, advance CTE in other ways. But there are a lot of internal reports, and also it can't be all things to all people. So what I've shared, those external pieces, we've really also tried to rethink how we create and make available reports for internal groups. Now, internal meaning to the State Department, but also to locals who are trying to analyze and interpret and then make actionable the data that we provide. So this is still ongoing. I will say a lot of this had to do with the change from Perkins 4 to Perkins 5 and many of the things Austin mentioned at the beginning with disaggregation. But I just wanted to show you a little bit about what we've tried to start doing. So we were guilty. We definitely just put out these lovely report cards that very jargony. They did have definitions, have each indicator just based on a card countability, the state targets, and then a district's performance relative to those targets. The way we've tried to at least get the ball moving in a better direction is to go from a report card to more of a trend analysis. So what are they supposed to do with those data? Well, it's helpful if they can see multiple years. They can kind of start to see trend lines, see how they are going, and so that they can address it. So we added some color and shading. I also want to mention a lot of these ideas came from a data quality institute. So other states might have very similar things. The sharing has been fantastic. But we're hopeful that this helps users interpret the data a little bit more and then take action relative to the trend lines and the colors and shading. So trying to make it a little bit more accessible with the colors, and then also more actionable because of the colors. This one's always a little overwhelming, I will say, but we took it to heart when we know we need to focus on disaggregation. So The trend report and this report go hand in hand. So the idea would be a local would be able to see at a high level trends across indicators and across subpopulations, and then dig even deeper in what this is called an indicator report, where we disaggregate every indicator by cluster, by subpopulation, and by special population. We also show the numerator and the denominator, because without these data, it's really hard to have a full understanding of where the issues might be and how, again, with trends, they might be addressed for improvement later on. It's bulky, I will say, but it is a step forward. And one of the ways we're trying to overcome some of the access is to really focus on support. And so every opportunity, this one included, we're trying to get in front of people who are interested and who may need to know this. We've done training webinars. We've tried to make information easily and explicitly accessible on our website to aid with interpretation. So we have all of the indicators, we have the definitions for who's a numerator, who's a denominator relative to each of these indicators. So anyone hopefully should be able to interpret the data a little bit more deeply. We've also created office hours where folks can just come and jump on and ask questions. We did that for our new Perkins applications, and it was just really well received in a very non-threatening way for interested and like-minded folks to just come on board and ask us questions. And then probably the biggest one is to just really focus on progress and not perfection. There's an endless amount of ways to improve in this space. So just trying to always move forward, using new and better information is how we're just trying to approach it. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel, which is one of the reasons it was so fun to be a part of this work group, because so many of the folks, all with many of the same needs, leverage the expertise and Advance CTE's leadership, to help us all get that jump start. So we don't have to go from 1 to 10 overnight. It truly is progress, not perfection. I say it to myself. I try to remind the team all the time because it really is, there's always going to be room to grow as we learn more and as we see more. So I leave with, this question, really, what's the story that needs to be told? There's so much happening in the world. Certainly, we've been on meetings a lot this week about, well, what is everything and the implications of COVID-19 have on Perkins data and Perkins accountability data. And there's just a lot of unknowns. But I think where this approach comes in is that we get to tell the story. The story isn't, COVID hit and we can't, we lost students and we didn't hit our indicators. That's not the story. The story is there's a pandemic and this is what happened, but these are our successes. And certainly there's areas where we don't know because of, data collection or what have you, or, faith in the data are, accurate or reliable, but it really is focusing on the story and then letting the numbers support the story instead of the other way around. So that's kind of how we've approached it. And I think it's been received pretty well. We've definitely got work still to do, but it's been fun to really rethink how we've approached and be more intentional. And I think these design principles and the toolkit, which everything's right there, is helping us just get a jump start on it. So with that, I will turn it back over to Austin.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. I love having you come on to talk about data because I feel like you're always you always like bring home the points that we want to make, talking about the power of data, more than just kind of within a compliance mindset, but really using data to kind of motivate change and communicate effectively with different stakeholders. We've got some time now for Q&A. We've had a few questions that have come through, and I want to encourage everybody on the call, if you do have questions for me or Katie, please drop those into the Q&A chat. But in the meantime, I wanted to get the conversation started with a question. So obviously, the big elephant in the room, and you kind of addressed this a little bit on your last slide, but the big elephant in the room is the pandemic. Collecting data this year has been really challenging. The way that CTE is being delivered is atypical. Some schools are still fully remote. Some of them are hybrid. So what would you say, like what strategies or advice would you give to other states that are thinking about how to communicate their CTE data this year and set expectations for what folks are going to see once that data is released?
It's such a hard question, and I might be stealing thunder from another question. But one way we've been trying to think about it is, there is just all sorts of data available, and Perkins performance data, Perkins indicators are just one type. And I think when we think of what our locals were able to pull off with the comprehensive local needs assessment and the narratives in there about what's working, what's not, where do we need to improve, and how are we going to get there. School didn't stop this year, so we know a lot of things happened. So trying to think about how we can think about those successes and those data, especially gearing up, we're on the eve of CTE month, how do we then, promote and make the case? I think it really is, I've said it before, got to break out of the car. There's so many other data elements to share and ways to highlight it. We've been trying to really elevate student voice and, hearing the stories that they have to tell about, how this year is impacted, but also, what they've learned through this year, and really, as you mentioned, not really come at it from a deficit perspective, but try to figure out how can we, continue on and show how CTE can be a central component. I know you guys put in the priorities, a central component of economic recovery from a local and a national perspective. There's just so much to tell. It's not what didn't happen or how we didn't meet things. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, those are all some great points. And I think it's going to be a little bit of an evolving strategy too as the situation changes. But that's so important. I mean, telling the student story too is so important, and bringing it back to the reality of what's happening on the ground. I did see, so we did get one question around recommendations for infographic design tools. I'll just put in a shameless plug. We, as part of this work group, we developed a bunch of different templates that you can use. They're in InDesign format, so that might be a slight limitation, but you can customize them fully and plug in your own state's data, and everything is already kind of laid out in a nice way. So please feel free to just fully steal those resources. That's what they're designed for. Otherwise, I don't know, Katie, do you have any recommendations for different tools that folks can use for infographics or other visualizations?
I will share that everything you saw from Nebraska, we are very spoiled with a lot of talent. Austin, to your point of finding someone who can bridge a lot of the graphics and design and data talent. So all of those were created in-house, but I do have a tool I will share that I just heard of a week or so ago. It's called Undraw, and it's all open and free. It's the same, it's the graphics that I used in this presentation. It's all free and openly licensed, but the coolest part about it is you can put in your colors. So if you have branded colors, you put in the special numbers and everything is in the theme of what you want. And that's been a really quick fix for someone who doesn't have a design background to make it look really sharp. But I would rely on what you guys have already put together. It aligns to the design principles, it's plug and chug, and it's really great.
Awesome. And if others on the call have other suggestions, I saw somebody noted that they use Canva. I've used Canva before. It's super user-friendly. But if you have other tools that you use, please drop those into the chat. We're all about kind of sharing knowledge here. So another question we got is, what is the name of your preferred Google extension for readability? So I included that in the slides, but we highlighted the No Coffee extension. That's what it's called. It plugs into Google Chrome in your web browser, and you can use it to rate the readability of different reports or websites. I think there are probably others out there as well, but that's the one that we specifically highlight in the report. Katie, do you know of any others?
It's actually an area we're still working on for one-stop shop. So I would probably defer to what you all recommended.
Great. I've got a question around, so somebody asked where exactly are the design templates located? Those are in the communications toolkit. It's one of the 2 links that was dropped into the chat earlier. They're all listed. You can download them directly from that resource page. And we'll share that link around afterwards in the follow-up email. We got a question from Jonathan Wickert. Please describe how you disaggregate audiences and create infographics that are specific to their interests and ability to understand data based on their input. Katie, do you have some thoughts about that? Did you involve any users in kind of getting input into the design, or did you do any kind of user testing with those tools?
Both great questions. We didn't, and I think this is an area, Austin knows this, but we have work to do, and these are great questions to help us guide it. I think where we're really trying to encourage and where the toolkit helps is a lot of this needs to be communicated locally, and figuring out how and what resonates for different audiences. Oftentimes, may change based on who those audiences are that you're trying to reach. So sometimes it's a little hard from a state perspective to try to, be all things to all people. But we've been intentional on trying to involve more voices. So I mentioned before students and others, and asking them the questions, just to your point, Austin, of, getting groups to share, making not only it accessible, but inviting. You also hit it on your talking points, just, even the language we use and making it, inviting and welcoming and I mean, accessible, to the various audiences. I think we all have some work to do there, but at a minimum, we rely on those messages from you all, from that study a couple years back, where you did a lot of the focus groups and a lot of that work. So that's really what we've relied on over the past couple years.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's such an important point. I mean, it can be really hard to always be going back to stakeholders and different users, but it's important to make sure that the resources that are being developed are serving their purpose. So if it's intended to communicate information, to build support for CTE, to provide transparency, then it helps to re-engage those different stakeholders to ensure that they're getting the information that they need. And even to, I mean, you were talking earlier about breaking out of the car and going beyond just the required Perkins indicators. That's another good question to ask stakeholders is, what data do you need to know? Here's all the things that we're required to report, but what else would be helpful for you when you're deciding, if you're a student, when you're deciding which program to enroll in, when you're deciding which career field you want to pursue, having information about, what they're looking for in reports, it will be really helpful to make sure that they're kind of meeting their needs.
I had that conversation earlier today about, we're planning our summer conference, and I was actually with Steve having a conversation, and he stopped me and he said, "How do you know what they need? Like we think, where we sit and we think, and we know what people need, but really, unless we start talking more and asking, and then the follow up, I think that'll be huge to the progress. We're not there yet. Going from 1 to 10 isn't the expectation, but I think these are really the key areas that we probably all need to dig in more to."
So on the topic of kind of engaging different users, we actually have a couple questions on the topic. So one is, how do you get buy-in from those who are lukewarm to using data for decision-making and action steps? So I guess the question is really like, how do you get people like to use the data instead of just sharing it out with them?
Good question. Probably, I think a lot depends on the audience. The first part of that question is like, how do you get the buy-in? A lot of enthusiasm and, just being everywhere, sharing really great info until it becomes like the joke of like, look at her, the data one. But really the getting folks to use it. First, we focus on those who, must use it, right? So our locals. So making it so it's a part of the process. So very intentionally, the data reports that we created and then provided a lot of training on and websites to help with, aligned with the questions in the local needs assessment, the comprehensive local needs assessment. And then the 4-year Perkins application was a follow-up of the needs assessment. I mean, it all very intentionally linked. So there wasn't an option to not use the data based on the questions we asked locals to respond to. And I think that has, well, I'm excited. I think it's going to be very helpful, as we think about refreshing or updating, whatever the law says, the needs assessment within 2 years. I think for the first time, we're going to see some very intentional focus on these narrow areas where we ask, folks to use data and apply, or make decisions based on those data, where I think in previous times we haven't had that. So this conversation in 2 years is going to be, I think, even more robust, because there is just data to spare. And it's just kind of shepherding everyone to think about, just as you said, how do we communicate it? What are we trying to, what's the story? What are we trying to, what's the call to action? Why are we bothering?
I'm really glad that you brought up the comprehensive local needs assessment, because I think that's the why, right? Like there's a new requirement for using data more intentionally at the local level to inform budgeting and planning and decision making. So it's easy for the state to kind of step in and say, hey, we've got all of these great resources that we've developed for you, and here's how you can use them. And it takes away the effort, the additional work that local CTE directors would have to do to kind of gather that data and understand it. If you can make it easily accessible, you can kind of help them interpret it, then there's an immediate action step right there with the local needs assessment. So I think that's a really good point. And just is even more kind of emphasizes how important it is for states to be providing data in a really useful and accessible way.
Especially when you then add a carrot, right? Like everything else so far is kind of the compliance part, but then we can incent the use, right? By aligning, competitive grants, using the reserve funds or other ways to say, okay, you did it, you're making good decisions, let's act on them. And, here's, even more reason to do so. It's kind of just lining it all up, I think has such great potential.
Mm-hmm. So kind of still on the topic of kind of public engagement and communication, how are you showing or explaining trend data to bridge between the definitions that have changed from Perkins 4 to Perkins 5? So COVID isn't the only thing that's kind of lurking in the background this year that's going to affect the data, because we have a new concentrator definition at the secondary and post-secondary level. We have some new indicators. So the data was already going to change. So how are you thinking about how to communicate that in Nebraska?
Another good question. It's kind of a unique position because we haven't had to, with the exception of, counts, because we don't really have a lot of performance data yet, and probably won't for some time because of COVID. But we've tried to make it, we've started a long time ago, I think. So when we were engaging in the state planning process, it was talking about some of the questions that would have impacts on the data, the biggest one being the concentrator definition, because right now, it all comes back from the accountability side on concentrators, no longer participants. So knowing we were going to change our definition, we've started, the bug is in everyone's ear, they're expecting it to be different. They might not know all the nuances of how it's different, but they know it's going to be different. So at least it wasn't such a shock, right? Setting expectations early that there's going to be changes, I think has helped. In terms of the nuances of the difference in the trend data, what we did there, just like we did to set the data or set the targets, is we've applied the new definitions to historical data. So when you saw that trend report, it was true trends as if it was all calculated under Perkins 5. And I think that's been one of the easiest ways to make it accessible, is they don't have to consider the differences. We're saying, all right, let's just assume the past 3 years we're using the same, the same logic to make these calculations. So it is hopefully one-to-one when they're comparing across years.
Yeah, that's super useful. And I to be honest, I wasn't even thinking about how you're providing past trend data when you're presenting the new indicators and using new denominators. So that's a really, really good point, is if you are going to be showing past data, either one, make sure that you're contextualizing that and explaining that there are new definitions that are being used, or two, retroactively recalculating that data so it is apples to apples.
And we had it all. I mean, because we had to do that to set our benchmarks. So I say it was easy, but the real data scientists did it. But they did it kind of quickly. So hopefully it's doable if you already had to create all of those, SQL codes or formulas or logic to pull it to begin with.
Mm-hmm. So I love this question. Do you have any advice around building data capacity at the local level so that local CTE leaders and teachers have the necessary data literacy to use the data? And I think that kind of dovetails a little bit with our conversation that we're having around the comprehensive local needs assessment. So do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, I'll just share one of the ways we've tried to do it is just relying on our collaborators. So there's a ton of people in schools and in school systems, big S, that are working on data, be it through multi-tiered systems of support or through just continuous improvement systems. It's just being a part of it. So it's not something else. So I think building capacity is just thinking really smart about who's already working in this space. How can this become a component of it so it's not a complete other thing? So we have educational service units in Nebraska who do a lot. There's even a data cadre where the whole purpose of it is just to talk about all the different data systems within the overarching ecosystem, right? That's the new word. So I think that has been a fruitful approach to at least get started. And leveraging tools, right? You guys just created a toolkit that are plug and chug. So, I mean, certainly that's easy to create. As for the interpretation and the data literacy, I think that's where building it into these existing systems that are reading books on data literacy because they're trying to, accomplish the same goals would be really helpful.
I've heard from other states that have kind of implemented their own like data quality institutes or kind of trainings or activities to help locals understand how to use the data. Have you done anything in Nebraska to that effect, specifically focused on kind of CTE data?
Big scale we have. So we have an annual data conference, and that's actually what those screenshot grabs that I had on my slides about the support were from. Mm-hmm. And so we have an opportunity. It's part of a larger, statewide initiative. But we have this year, understandably, we focused really on the changes and what's different. The interesting part is the folks who show up to those are often data stewards who are more focused on getting all of the data and making sure the data is accurate and getting it submitted. It's not always the same people who you think would then do something with the data and then communicate out the data. So another area, really, I think focusing as local as possible, Coalition of the Willing, through the needs assessment, folks found really great things, a lot of great things. And so just helping them leverage that and amplify it, I think is probably our path.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So I want to ask one final question, which is around this idea of kind of state level capacity and investment in this work. So one thing that we hear that I've heard a lot, especially from smaller states, is, we would love to build out these great dashboards. We would love to, we understand the importance of data. We just don't have the time. We don't have the resources. And it's really hard to do, and it's really hard to do it right. What advice would you give to states that have limited capacity and limited resources to do data communication effectively?
It's a really great question. I would put us in that boat, I think, in terms of we're a small state, limited resources. I think that's where I go back to progress, not perfection. We don't have a fun interactive dashboard. We don't have Tableau. I mean, we don't have any of those. So what can we do? We can tell stories and we can try to, use the existing resources and at least align, if you know better, do better. So you told us what messages resonate. So we started sharing those messages. And I think that's just it. It's just every which way. I'll say when we had a dedicated data person, that probably would be amazing. And I don't know how I figured out a way to not rehire that position because it really would be great if someone could just be focused on it. But we're trying to just get our bugs in everyone's ears, partnering with universities. There's a lot of grad students who are always looking for ideas. So we actually have a couple different irons in the fire to, pay a grad assistantship, which is a bargain to have a grad student just focused on, something in this space. So trying to get creative, it's an ongoing issue. So progress, not perfection. It's just a mantra I repeat. Any step forward in the right direction, I think is a good step.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Can you move us to the next slide real quick? So I wanted to put in a final plug for the resources. So when we developed these and we convened the work group, it was really thinking about like those low capacity states that just don't have the time or resources to develop all of this stuff on their own, or looking for a little bit of a kind of the right direction to move on some of this stuff. So we tried as much as possible to take out some of the guesswork, to do some of the background research, and to put together some templates that could be useful. So again, the design principles report includes some principles and strategies for reporting data effectively. You can use that resource as kind of a checklist to go through and evaluate your current reporting tools. And then the second resource, which I didn't really have time to dig into at length today, is the communications toolkit. And it's just a wealth of resources. It includes a step-by-step guide for building a communications plan, identifying different audiences, deciding what types of tools you want to develop, if that's an infographic or a PowerPoint or a video. And then there are some templates in there that you can fully steal and customize and use in your own state. So I just wanted to give one more plug for those resources. I encourage you to check those out, especially as you're thinking about how to report out your Perkins 5 data after this year's CAR report submission. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining today's Advance CTE webinar. I also want to thank Katie Graham for joining us and sharing her wisdom with everybody. And I also want to acknowledge too the input from the Association for Career and Technical Education. They were incredible partners in helping us lead this work group and develop these resources. So a lot of this work and a lot of this knowledge should be credited to them. After leaving this meeting, ask that everybody please complete a quick evaluation that will pop up in your web browser. We want to make sure that this series is meeting your needs. And I promise you, we all are data nerds here at Advance CTE. We do look at that data and we use that to help us improve the quality of our programming. And as I mentioned earlier, a recording of this call will be posted to the Advance CTE website and to our YouTube channel for your reference. So you can come back to this conversation, you can share it with your friends, whatever makes sense to you. And then we will share out information for additional and future webinars. So please keep a lookout for that. We have some excellent programming scheduled out for the remainder of the year. So thanks again for everybody. And Sarah, if you could please go ahead and activate the evaluation, and then we can wrap up. Thanks, everyone.